Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for being here, and let's dive in. So, we're here because we want to have a safer community and a more fun community. So, I'm hoping that the next few slides, you might be able to learn something for yourself or maybe share that information with others. Um, Again, this is recorded, so you're welcome to come back for it. If you want the slides, let me know. Um, yeah. As we begin, I just want to make it very clear where TRiPS stands. Obviously, psychedelics are illegal in most areas. And so we want to be clear that we're not encouraging drug use. We're also not condoning psychedelic use. And so all of this information is meant to be information for educational purposes only, to ensure that, people are aware of, make informed choices about how they want to move in life. So, um, yeah, that's where we're at on that. And then just to share a pretty basic agenda about where we'll go this evening. Um, we're going to start with some history, talk a little bit of the historical background of psychedelics, substances, and then we'll go into some safety and prep information, then move on to harm reduction, and then lastly, integration before having a Q&A. And I just want to reiterate, this is um, it's very basic baseline information. And yet, there still might be questions that you have or things that you're not sure about. Again, I just want to reiterate, please just ask questions in the chat. No question is too dumb. Like, it's okay. Like, you're not going to look stupid. No one's judging you. Like, we're all here to learn. So I really just want to reiterate. We really just want you to be able to at the end of this session, be able to close down your computer, know, having learned something, but also knowing that you have a community to come to if you have any questions or concerns. Um, Also, if we could drop the link to the Discord in the chat for folks to join that. That's our group. We're always posting resources and informations and things to get up to date on what's happening with psychedelics across the nation and across the world. Um, so, all of that being said, I really want to start off with our the ancient origins of psychedelics, right? So, since the dawn of time, humans have been exploring substances. Um, and we wouldn't be in this position today of like, medicalizing and doing research on psychedelics and being able to have access to these medicines had indigenous people not passed down this wisdom from generation to generation. So we really just want to honor all of those who came before us and nurtured a relational way of being, and also who fought for cognitive liberty. Um, and we don't just want to recognize this, we also want to honor with respect. We want to recognize like reparations are due. And you can do that personally by giving, by donating, by supporting land back movements, citing your work. If you're ever like referring to indigenous practices or native practices, like being able to cite the origins, being able to cite references, is an important part of this. And not just including, but centering Native and Indigenous voices. So I really just want to, yeah, make sure that we can not only cherish this information, but replenish who and what has been harmed in the process of psychedelics becoming so accessible. Um, yeah, so let's just have just a very, very brief history lesson here. So I just want to touch on, I mentioned about indigenous practices, traditional uses. In many cases, um, psychedelics were used in ceremony. They were used for, um, you know, in all kinds of contexts, right? In social gatherings, rites of passage, hunting, like in the hunting process. Um, and it's also important to mention that psychedelics have not always been used for healing and for like quote unquote positive things. They've also been used, in black magic or to harm people. And so I really just want to like recognize that history, that it's not all like sunshine and rainbows and healing. There's quite a wide spectrum of um, what people have been using medicines for. Um, and so when we think about, psychedelics and substances, um, maybe you might first think of mushrooms or ayahuasca or San Pedro, also known as wachuma. Peyote also has mescaline. And I just want to kind of name some of these more popular or more well-known at this time medicines and some of their origins, right? So ayahuasca is from the Amazon jungle. Iboga and ibogaine are from Gabon in Africa. Psilocybin can be traced back to Oaxaca in Mexico, but also it has many origins across the planet, right? LSD, for example, is derived from ergot, and it was synthesized in Switzerland. Peyote is, centered in like southern, what is now the US and Mexico. Huachuma or San Pedro is like mainly from the Andes, but also throughout Central America. Um, just to name a few more, MDMA is derived from saffrole, but it was synthesized in Germany. Opium is from Asia. There's different DMT containing plants across Asia and Australia. Cannabis, has its origins in Asia and Africa, right? So as we can see, like these medicines that we now have access to right here in Pittsburgh or Arizona, wherever you're calling in from, they have origins all over the world, and now we're able to access them within this country. And so I just want to kind of recognize the path that these medicines have taken to be able to reach us, and the paths that we also can take to reach them in their more traditional contexts. Um, so I just want to invite you to maybe put in the chat uh, a substance or like a psychedelic or like a part of the world that intrigues you. Maybe it just interests you, or you're interested in learning more about. I also want to say that, like for example, I mentioned opium and iboga and ibogaine. They're not classified as traditional psychedelics, and we'll talk more about what that means in just a moment here. But they're also just often lumped into the term of a psychedelic because they alter your state of consciousness. Right? We're going to talk a little bit about psychedelic versus psychoactive in just a moment here. Um, but yeah, also just to touch on like mid 20th century, like we've gone from clinical research to criminalization, and now we're currently in a quote unquote renaissance. And I do, things have changed drastically in the last 10 years to what information is available. So I want to recognize that. I also want to recognize the word renaissance is not necessarily appropriate. Like, you know, it's maybe a renaissance for like Western culture. But I want to recognize like the lineages and the traditions that have been continuing to use psychedelics in many different uh in many different spaces. Like so it's not a global renaissance. It's really just mostly a renaissance for the Western eye. Um, so yeah, let's keep going here. And just to kind of talk about the word psychedelic, the the term was coined in 1956 in a letter from Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist in Europe. He used the term psychedelic in a letter to Aldous Huxley, who is another researcher, psychiatrist, and like well-known person in the psychedelic space. He's written many wonderful texts. I highly recommend reading them if you get a chance. And then, of course, after that, in the 50s and the 60s and 70s, the word psychedelic became more popular and used more widely to describe these substances. Another word that I sometimes use that can also, be used in this space is entheogen. Theo meaning God, kind of referring to like finding the God within. It usually has more of like a religious, spiritual context, but it was also kind of just a term coined by people in the Western psychedelic world. Um, so yeah, just touching one more moment on psychedelics. Of course, they profoundly alter, or they can profoundly alter our perception, our mood, cognition. And so when we think about what is a psychedelic and what is not, classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, mescaline, or not really MDMA, but more so mescaline. They are serotonin receptor agonists, so 5-HT2A agonists. And so what that means is that they share a structural similarity with serotonin. And so it allows them to act as an agonist at the serotonin receptors. So it's essentially mimicking a substance, a drug that's found naturally within us and kind of helps to elevate that within our bodies. And so the intensity of the experience can often correspond to this degree of activation in our bodies. And that would be like the main source of the hallucinogenic effects or like the psychoactive effects there. Um, Yeah, there's like so much to go into here about like the pharmacology and the neuroscience of it all. If you want to nerd out on that with me, please just feel free to reach out. Maybe we'll do like another whole series just on that if anyone is interested. Um, I will say that also largely the psychedelic term, like cannabis and ketamine and amanita are not technically psychedelics, like they're not classic psychedelics, but they are often kind of lumped into the psychedelic umbrella, even though they're not serotonergic. Right? Like ketamine and amanita are dissociative, so they work with a different part of the brain. They impact the GABA and glutamate receptors. Um, Cannabis obviously works with the cannabinoid system in the body. So technically, they're not psychedelics, but again, I think that I include them in here. A lot of groups include them in here. If you want to get to the nitty-gritty, by all means. Um, and then there's just one more thing I want to make, the psychedelic versus the psychoactive, right? When we think of psychedelics, we're usually envisioning like, a substance that brings some kind of vision or hallucination, or, it's a very visual focused word. Um, and it's psychedelics are also psychoactive, but not all psychoactives are psychedelic, right? Like coffee is a psychoactive. Lots of substances are psychoactive. So I just wanted to make a point about that word there. Um, I will just say one more thing about specifically about ayahuasca. Um, I think it's important to note that the International Ayahuasca Gathering of Indigenous People in Brazil they decided together collectively that they did not want ayahuasca to be considered a psychedelic. So there's a little bit of complexity around the language, as you can see. And so I just invite that to reflect a little bit about the complexity, the meaning, and the experience to hold. And like, if it's just something to be aware of. Um, yeah. Um, Moving on here. So let's jump in to talk about set and setting. So we've talked a little bit about different psychedelics. Another idea we have is to maybe go into educational sessions on each specific psychedelic, to kind of deep dive a little bit if folks are interested. If you're interested, please just let us know. But I want to talk more broadly about safety for now. So set and setting, right? Set and setting is a common thing in the psychedelic realm to think about if you're going to consume psychedelics. So let's break it down a little bit. Set is your mindset, right? How are you feeling at the time that you are deciding to, you're deciding that you want to go on some kind of journey? What is your mental health like at this time? What might your intentions be, and what might your expectations be? Oh, I have that on there twice. Um, Essentially, like, are you okay? Like, what's your capacity? What's your capacity to hold yourself? Are you resourced? Do you have any specific intentions? And it's also important to note that no intention is also an intention. Um, and the other thing to think about, again, is your expectations. It's crucial here to know where you are in the spectrum. Like, why are you wanting to try psychedelics? If you're feeling like very desperate and like feeling like you need a cure, you're going to put very high expectations on, for example, a mushroom journey, and it might not meet those expectations. And then what happens? And then where do you go? Right? So recognizing that um, you want to know what your expectations are going into whatever journey you're partaking in, and hold it lightly. And the same thing with intentions. You want to know like how you're directing your energy and your intention for the journey, but you also want to hold it lightly. Because one thing that we know for sure about psychedelics is that we never know what's going to happen. We never know how our body or our mind is going to respond or react. And so holding intention and holding expectation lightly, but keeping that with us, but holding it lightly is crucial here. Um, and just to add a little bit more to that, we may have every intention to heal something or to embark on a shadow work, or maybe just to have fun. And the medicine maybe provokes otherwise. Maybe you're out and about in a public setting at a club or a dance party or something, and then you just have an emotional cathartic release, right? You weren't maybe planning for that, but it happened, right? Or likewise, maybe you're in a very like ceremonial setting, and everything is prepared and set up, and maybe you feel like nothing comes through for you, right? But you had every intention to like focus on a particular part of your healing, right? So it's just being mindful of um intention and expectation there. I also, under the conversation of mindset, also want to have like a conversation around suicidal ideation, and just recognizing like if you've been suicidal in your life, or especially recently, as if you are choosing to consume psychedelics, it's something to be very mindful of. Um, it needs to be known that um, sometimes psychedelic experiences can make you think about death, or might make you think about like the suicidal thoughts that you've had in the past, or, um, you know, it's just important to kind of recognize like what might come up and making sure that you have support available to you if that happens. And just knowing that it's possible is important. Again, just knowing where your support system is. Do you have someone that you can call? Do you have Fireside Project's number handy? Do you know where to turn for when you need that kind of support? So just something to be further mindful of there. Um, and as we talk about setting, the setting, right, is our environment, our physical space. What is the social support or network that is present there? Is there privacy, right? The who and what is in the space is just as important. Um, we're talking about also lighting, sound, textures, objects that are in the area. Maybe some feel supportive, maybe some do not. Right? Making sure that there's a bathroom close by for you, making sure you have ample water during your journey and food if you feel called to that. Just having your basic needs met. Um, and if we think more about the place that you're in, are you in a club? Are you in a facilitated ceremony? Are you in you or your friend's living room? Like where might you think about where you might be? And if you're with people that you trust, or maybe you're not. Um, and thinking about, does the environment feel forced? Does it feel rushed? Right? You want to be mindful about all those things. Does the environment feel overstimulating or overwhelming in any way before you take a substance? That's something to consider um, before you take a substance, because often any of these things might be amplified. Um, yeah, and then a note on privacy. Um, Do you feel like you have privacy in the space that you are in? Do you feel like you can feel comfortable being your full self? Sometimes simply being in a place where you cannot be yourself can be constricting and maybe lead to like a challenging trip in that sense. Um, So it's just something to be aware of. All of these things are things to think about before you ingest a substance, right? And sometimes a lot of like stimulation and chaos can be challenging during a journey. But sometimes it can also like increase our capacity to hold space for ourselves, and sometimes not at all, right? So I guess to give an example there, like, you know, of lived experience. Like, sometimes in parts of my life, a rave has been like the perfect setting for me to enjoy psychedelics. In other parts of my life, that would not that would not support me well. Same with like being in a quiet, private space. There's settings for everyone, and it's important to be aware of what yours is. Um, I also want to make two more notes here. A side note about paranoia. Um, Paranoia in your mindset, can often come up in a particular setting. Maybe if you don't trust the people that you're with, or maybe you're just not sure. Like it's hard to judge accurately, like the safety of a place, right? We don't always know. Like even if people say that a space is safe, it might not always be safe, right? So just being aware that like sometimes paranoia arises in psychedelic, like when you're tripping, whether you're in a DMT trip, whether it's psilocybin, whether it's cannabis, and just allowing yourself to assess, like, do I feel safe in this space? How can I make this space safer for myself for the time being? Sometimes the paranoia is not, it's not real, right? Sometimes the people in our setting like really are safe and they're supportive, but we're paranoid. Sometimes that might be your intuition offering some kind of information or protection to you. So it's really important to just be aware of that and to allow yourself to practice discernment in those spaces. Um, so. Yeah. And then one more thing here for like mindset and setting when we're talking about set and setting is like screen use when you're tripping and also post trip. It's just something to be aware of and to be mindful of. Maybe, depending on what kind of space you're in, you might choose to have maybe a shared agreement to keep screen use to a minimum. Or maybe it's something that doesn't bother you and it feels like it contributes to making the environment feel better for you. It's just something to be aware of. Um, and, sometimes it might be what's being so stimulating or overstimulating for someone is that there's a screen playing something, or the screen is going off, it's buzzing, or, um, yeah, it's also important to recognize like anytime that we look at a screen, it kind of distracts us from the present moment. So yeah, it's just something to think about as you decide to trip, like if that's an agreement that you want to make with yourself or the people that you're with, or maybe not. Um, yeah, let's keep going. I just really resonated with this meme. I thought it would bring a little bit of comic relief. When the acid kicks in and they know, you knew that they know. I don't know if you've ever had that meta, perception in an altered state, but it's pretty common. Sometimes that can lead to paranoia. So it's just, something to be aware of, right? Um, yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep going into preparation. Um, all right, so this is just a very basic crash course, of course. But when we are preparing for a psychedelic journey, there's a few things that you want to think about in order to, support a trip that can be meaningful or supportive to you, right? So defining clear intentions, again, that also can be no intention, right? And your expectations and just being aware of like what is present for you, what is coming forth there. Um, you know, Maybe it's curiosity, maybe you're wanting to heal something, maybe you're wanting to experience joy, maybe you're wanting to dive into some shadow work, maybe you're just looking for some spiritual connection, connecting with your ancestors, right? The list is pretty limitless for what you might be engaging, why you might be engaging. Um, and, it might not even always be about a big cathartic healing journey, right? Sometimes the most th healing thing is to just have some fun, right? So, um, as the medicalization of psychedelics continues and like research continues, there might be less and less emphasis on like recreational use. And I just want to remind you that while illegal in many places, people are going to do that anyways because people like to experience joy. People like to have fun, right? So there's many different ways that you can engage in this legally and illegally. And so just reminding you that, you know, there's multiple reasons why people might engage in this path. Um, Yeah, and then of course, like there's the reverence and the sacredness of psychedelics and like medicine work, right? And it doesn't have to require us to take ourselves so seriously. I mean, some journeys you might feel like absolutely nothing happened. And honestly, that can be normal, right? So we never know what might arise in our journeys. So again, important to hold the intentions and the expectations lightly and with curiosity, right? Mental health checks are so important. If you ever go into surgery or like any kind of medical procedure, you're gonna like go through the intake form. They're gonna know what medications you've been on, what is your health history, what is your mental health history. Like when I say how important it is to do that before a psychedelic journey, I really mean it. Like take inventory of like do you have a history of psychosis in your family or a history of bipolar disorder? Like what mental health conditions are known in your family? Is there like a known history of addiction, right? And then knowing your medications, like what medications are you currently on? What medications have you been on recently? There's plenty of contraindications that can be present. I'm not going to go into that now, but we can certainly have an entire, education series around that. If you're interested, please just let us know. Um, and so again, knowing your history, knowing your meds, and then also having a plan if you feel like an emergency arises or you need medical support. Something that I like to recommend to people is that they have Fireside Project on speed dial to be able to call if they feel like they're having a problem. But also I like to have like my friend who's a nurse, I recommend folks to like have medical providers who are friends or maybe a part of their network who might be able to provide some support because oftentimes, there might not be a medical emergency present. That's not always the case. There sometimes can be, but more often than not, it's the ego feeling like it's dying, right? Or maybe feeling like completely overstimulated and it's just you just don't know how to respond, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about like challenging things to look out for as well as contraindications in a few slides. Um, Yeah, and just one more thing about that. When we're talking about like mixing things, like polysubstance use, the likelihood of there being some contraindication usually becomes higher, right? The more substances that we use sometimes. So it's something to always be aware of. And I'm gonna show you the contraindication chart on the next slide, I believe. Um, there are excellent resources for looking for contraindications online. Siloscreen.me is a good one. Psychedelicinteractions.com is one. And those, I'm going to have those resources on the very last slide for you to be able to record, take a picture. We can even post them into the chat if that would be helpful. But another thing that you might want to do is to connect with a pharmacist who is psychedelic friendly, someone who knows the contraindications between certain medications. And there are several pharmacists in the Pittsburgh area, but also nationally, that you can actually like book a session with and say, "Hey, I'm going to go on this journey. Like, can we talk about my medications?" So that's something to be aware of. Um, and if you need that kind of information or those contacts, please just let us know. We're happy to help support folks in getting the information that they need. Um, yeah, so and then moving on to preparing our mind, body, and our space. What might that look like? Well, sleeping well, reducing like other substances could potentially be supportive. Of course, there are some psychedelics that have great synergy together, but you want to be really mindful have discernment there, right? Sleeping well is such an underrated way to prepare for a good trip, right? Hydrating, eating whole foods, you know, not super processed foods, those can all be helpful. So maybe you're kind of catching the drift that like taking substances at a festival where you might not be sleeping, you might not be hydrating as much, you might not be eating, the best foods for you, can also maybe be a challenging place to explore psychedelics. So it's all just things to keep in mind. Um, Again, these aren't even recommendations. This is just information for you to have and to think about and to stay curious about. The last thing here is just knowing your local laws, knowing where things are legal and illegal, where things are decriminalized, or where things might be research only, psychedelic use, and just knowing like what what is possible, can be helpful in knowing how you can respond, and knowing like who to call if there's an issue. So again, we have all kinds of resources to learn more about this and know. I actually have a reference on the last slide, for this as well. But yeah, just being like aware. People are going to choose to do drugs anyways. They're going to choose to do psychedelics anyways. Um, my take, and a lot of people in this industry's or in this realm's take, is to just be informed about the choices you may or may not be making. Um, so yeah, we'll just go to the next slide here and highlight the drug contraindication chart. This is by TRiPS. It's very big. You can't really see a lot going on here. I invite you to visit their website. You can really zoom in, and they also kind of break down specifically, like give more information for literally each and every interaction. As you can see, there's a lot of substances that have like pretty good synergy. It might not be harmful to take them at the same time, and then there are some that could potentially be pretty harmful. So it's all just, something to keep in mind, um, and to keep you informed about what you might decide to do. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about dosing. So the first and foremost, start low, go slow is, a really common phrase. You've probably heard it before. Um, you know, um, this is this is really like where you want to start, if you're going to start, right? Like, it's always okay to just not have anything happen than to just be completely overwhelmed and, feel like you had a very challenging or even traumatic trip, right? It's better for like nothing to happen or it to be very mild than to be the opposite side of the spectrum, right? You can always take more, right? Is what a lot of folks say. Um, yeah, and then so I kind of want to frame it like, if you meet a new person, like you're not going to immediately get married to them and then like live with them, right? Like I invite you to maybe think about it more like a relationship. Like how would you get to know a person? How would you get to know a person slowly over time to build a trustworthy relationship, right? So that's how I like to think about start low, go slow. Um, and so we think about microdosing, mesodosing, macrodosing. Microdosing, right, if you're already familiar, is the subperceptual level. So you're not supposed to feel anything. It's the dose is supposed to be so low that yes, it's there in your body, it's working in your body, but you're not feeling like, an immense catharsis. You're not seeing visuals. You're not like it's meant to be something that you're not really feeling. Um, And so the mesodose would be just a little bit higher. If we're talking about dosing, for example, in terms of like psilocybin, a microdose might be zero point 0.2 grams, zero point 0.3. Um, so a mesodose might be like a gram, 2 grams, right? You're certainly going to feel something, right? You're certainly going to feel the altered state. Um, and then the macrodose might be more like 2 to 2.5, 3, 4, 5, and beyond grams, right? You're taking a larger dose where you are most certainly going to be tripping, right? Um, and I do want to touch on for a moment what people call the heroic dose. That's often considered like 5 grams or more. Um, and yeah, I just want to invite you to maybe think a little bit more about dosing. You know, everyone is going to um, feel a dose differently. It's going to everyone's biological makeup is slightly different. And so everyone's going to respond or react slightly differently. So like 5 grams for someone might feel very intense for someone for one person, but it might not for another person. Or like maybe zero point 0.5 is a microdose for some people, but it's not a microdose for other people, right? So it's just something to be really aware of. Like dosing can be subjective for people. So that's why, if you are, that's another reason why start low, go slow is so important, because you never know, like, how much it's going to impact you. I don't know, you've probably seen the meme where the person is like, that wasn't a microdose. And there's like, visuals in their background, and like, it's a thing. It's very much a thing. Like you just start low, go slow. Yeah. Um, Yeah, and so the other thing to really be aware of is sourcing, where you source your medicine from. Obviously, we're not going to talk about where you get your if you take psychedelics, we're not sharing that kind of information in this space. That's not what this space is for. But the person that you source from, or the person that grows, or the person that makes, or whatever, um, like the purity of a substance also affects the dosing. Right? So maybe they might say, it's 5 grams of mushrooms, but maybe, it's in powder form. Maybe it's like dried mushrooms. Maybe it's like moist mushrooms. There's all different kind. Maybe it's in tea, right? And you might never fully know unless you measure it yourself. Or if you're thinking about like if you get substances and you're using them like from a pen or you're smoking something. Um, yeah, it's just always important to be aware of the source, the purity, and then testing, right? Testing your substance. Um, right. So, for example, testing substances like MDMA, testing substances like DMT, is important. Testing substances like ketamine, are all particularly crucial, because they can often be, or they can sometimes be in white powder form. And then the likelihood of there being something else mixed in there, might be a little bit higher, right? So we always want to check and test our substances. And I just wanted to show a few examples here. So here I have testing strips from Overdrive. This is a fentanyl testing strip. I have fentanyl strip, and then the medetomidine strips um, from Wise Batch. And then another resource that I've linked in the reference page is Bunk Police. They have testing information for like every single substance that you can imagine. So I highly recommend checking them out. This is like to detect fentanyl in any substance. So just a few things to keep in mind there. Um, and then we'll talk a little bit more about sourcing on the next page, I believe. So your body, your experience. So what I was saying earlier, like everyone's gonna react or like experience it in a slightly different way. So it's just recognizing that like you might read about someone's experience on the internet, or someone might share about their experience. Um, or someone might share about their personal experience, and it might be completely different to what you experience. Um, Everyone metabolizes things differently. So, just another thing to be mindful, your body, your experience. And I did just want to make a note on like quote unquote bad trips. There's a common saying among like facilitators and just people in the space that say that there's no such thing as a bad trip. And while I really hear that and I recognize the value of, bad or challenging trips, if someone tells me that they have a bad trip, I believe them. I'm not going to try to like make it seem like try to help them to rush to try to help them like reframe it as a challenging trip, or like, oh, it's an opportunity for growth, or oh, your integration is going to be so good and so ripe. Like, yes, and uh it's just something to be mindful of, right? And then, challenging trips are common, right? And if eventually you can get to a reframe that it's challenging and it was helpful for growth, great. But that's not like the immediate need usually when someone is really having a really hard time, right? So it's just something to be mindful of when you're talking about that with other folks. Um, all right, let's talk a little bit more about drug checking. So like I mentioned, the source, even if you trust the person immensely, still test. Unless you literally watch them test it in front of you, and you see them do the things that you're supposed to do to test it, then I would certainly test it. There can be all kinds of adulterants, like not just things like fentanyl. There's all kinds of other things that can be in substances. Um, and so like even if you trust the person, I would honestly still trust. This is where you take responsibility for your to make informed decisions and for your cognitive liberty, right? Um, it's important to note, yeah, the tools, there's so many different tools. Like I mentioned, Bunk Police has like every kind of regent test that exists. Lab testing services is also great. Um, Fentanyl test strips. There's all kinds of tools and resources. And if you're looking for any of those tools and resources, please let us know. That's something that we have access to and can help people to have access to. And so some of the organizations that support and advocate for drug checking are like Dance Safe, Ecstasy Data, Bunk Police, Arrowhead, oops, spelled that wrong, and SSDP. So Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Um, yeah, I just want to like highlight a few examples here. Like, there's certain psilocybin or mushroom chocolate bars that could easily not have any psilocybin in them, right? So again, it's important to just be really mindful about where you're getting if you're getting these kinds of things. Even something, MDMA, like I mentioned, ketamine, all important to test. Even something like ayahuasca, a tea really that's made from plants. All kinds of different things can be mixed in there. I have heard all kinds of horror stories and been a witness to many integration sessions where, you know, ayahuasca brews have had just not ayahuasca, not ayahuasca in them. So it's just something to be very mindful of there. Always test. And fortunately, like it's becoming, these kinds of test kits are becoming more common and they're becoming more accessible to folks. So yeah, highly recommend. And it's also not a bad idea to have something like naloxone around or Narcan um, that helps to reduce the fatality of an overdose. Because again, you might not always know what's in your substances unless you check them. So it's always good to have something like that on hand just in case. So let's keep going. Feel free to drop any comments or questions in the chat. I'll take maybe just 2 more minutes, 2 or 3 more minutes. So if you're choosing support for like a space holder, a sitter, a facilitator of any kind, just being mindful about um, them, right? You never want to use alone. Like that's a very common harm reduction tool working with psychedelics. You never want to use alone. Maybe you are a very experienced person and you might want to use alone. But having someone on speed dial, like having a plan of support, letting your neighbor or your friend know what's going on. Having Fireside Project, again, Fireside Project is a great resource. Um, Phenomenal to just like have available in your phone. Um, yeah, knowing your expectations, what level of trust are you at, knowing your limits and your boundaries, um, all things to be mindful of here. I'm kind of going to zoom through some things here. Um, because I'm noticing the time. So coming back to challenging experiences versus medical emergencies, right? So challenging experiences are just that, right? Oh, it's just deeply, deeply challenging sometimes. And sometimes though truly the best thing that you can do is come back to your breath. Remind yourself that you are breathing, that you're alive. If you need to like touch give yourself a squeeze or a pinch to remind yourself that you have a body, that you are a human. Yeah, and also things like helping like reducing stimulation. Um, Sometimes water and food can be really grounding. If you have someone trustworthy there, maybe like someone holding your hand or like placing a hand on the head, only if like there's conversation of consent there. Um, Using validating phrases. I tend to repeat this to myself. I'm safe, like this will pass. I know this is a lot, but like eventually this will be over. Like keep going, like keep breathing. Um, and then, if you're ever in a scenario, at a festival or in a ceremony or, knowing the difference between a challenging experience and a medical emergency is important, right? So if you're looking for signs of a seizure, you're looking for loss of consciousness, you're looking for like very distorted breathing, um, you're looking for like extreme heart rates or like very, very low heart rates, right? So knowing a few of those things can help you to decipher like if you need to bring in medical services or if, maybe this person is having an ego death and it's very challenging, but it's not a medical emergency, right? So just being aware of that. I also want to highlight that in several traditions historically, um, that usually it's just the medicine person or the curandero, the healer, or the quote unquote shaman that is actually, for example, drinking the ayahuasca or, for example, drinking the wachuma or the peyote. It's only more recently been brought into, you know, each person individually taking a substance and so it's just something to ponder, right? How we've moved, how things have moved from kind of that setting and understanding in some traditions to now more commonly that, anyone that partakes is usually yeah, just something to think about there. Um And just for a few laughs, when you start panicking and ask your trip buddy how many hours the shrooms are gonna last, and it turns into infinity. I like to say that, maybe the trip only lasts for, 5 or 6 hours, but hopefully they stay with you for the rest of your life, right? Hopefully the psilocybin or the DMT or whatever you might be consuming, hopefully that the presence of the medicine can be a positive force for you and with you, like for the rest of your life. Um, and let's keep going to integration. Yeah, so integration, the process of making sense of what you experienced, applying insights post experience, the process of understanding, the process of recognizing, process of feeling. What might it look like or feel like for you to embody that experience? What did you learn? What did you remember? Like, what do you want to bring forth from that experience? Um, there's yeah, just a lot of sustained benefits from being able to go through a process of integration and not just, taking a substance, going directly back to your day-to-day life, like nothing changes. Like for some people, that's going to be their experience. That's fine. But for some people, especially if your intention is to do some deeper healing, to do some shadow work, to do some spiritual exploration or connection, integration is a helpful post process, right? And it can look so many different ways. It might look like working one-on-one with someone. It might look like joining integration circles or integration groups. It might looking just doing some like one-on-one care for yourself. And so we'll kind of go into a few examples. And yes, this is our last slide, so I'll try to make it quick. Right, writing about your experience can be helpful for some people. Writing out how do you feel, what changed, if anything, what do you want to do differently in your life, what visions and feelings do you want to bring to your daily life. Movement, somatic work can always be helpful. Or maybe just stillness. Maybe the medicine reminded you that stillness is wanting to make itself known in your life more, is a practice that you want to explore more. Therapy, or talking with an integration practitioner or a coach, or maybe a peer support group, or maybe talking to like Fireside Project for their integration calls or a trusted friend. I will just say, in terms of therapy, just like be mindful, like maybe your therapist is not psychedelic friendly. Unfortunately, I have had that issue before and was chastised by my therapist for doing psychedelics. So, just, make sure that you are with people who can hold you in that and who are psychedelic friendly, or, at least being able to hold you in a non-judgmental space as you process. Of course, being outside, going on a walk, observing how you relate with the more than human world. If you listen to any music during the journey, maybe listening to that music again, like these are some very basic things that you could do to support your integration over longer periods of time, and just kind of sinking yourself into some tangible practices. Um, so I'm going to stop there and open up for questions. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat. And, if there's anything that this is like super basic crash course, right? So if there's anything that you want to dive deeper in, let us know. And we can kind of center future series and sessions on, very specific topics. Okay, so just